Imagine driving home after a basketball game with your friends, laughing about the plays you just watched, maybe planning to grab a late-night snack before heading to bed because tomorrow's the big day, the tournament you've been training for all season. Now imagine that within hours, you and your friends will be trapped in a frozen mountain wilderness, 70 miles from where you should be, making decisions that will baffle investigators for nearly 50 years. This isn't fiction. This is the story of 5 men who vanished on February 24, 1978, leaving behind one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. 4 bodies would eventually be found in conditions that defied explanation. The 5th man, he simply disappeared, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. What happened on that dark mountain road has tormented families, consumed investigators, and spawned theories ranging from the logical to the absolutely bizarre. But here's what makes this case truly disturbing. The more evidence we uncover, the less sense any of it makes. Tonight we're going to walk through every documented fact, every contradictory testimony, and every theory that's emerged from decades of investigation. We're going to meet the only witness who claims to have seen these men alive that night. A man whose story changes with every telling, whose behavior raises more questions than answers, and who might hold the key to understanding why 5 friends drove to their deaths in the Sierra Nevada mountains. This is the story of the Yuba County 5, and nothing about it will let you sleep peacefully tonight. Let's begin with who these men really were, because understanding them is crucial to understanding why their disappearance doesn't fit any easy explanation. For too long, this case has been clouded by misconceptions, by casual cruelty disguised as analysis, by people who saw their involvement with Gateway Project, a program supporting people with developmental challenges, and immediately dismissed them as helpless or incapable. That characterization isn't just wrong. It's dangerous because it's led investigators and armchair detectives alike down completely false paths. Ted Vire was 32 years old, a man who had served in the military, who understood discipline and survival training. Jack Hewitt was 24, known for his mechanical skills and his devotion to his mother. Bill Sterling, 29, had a steady job and was considered the group's natural leader during their basketball games. Jack Madruga, 30, was the only one who owned a car, responsible enough to be trusted with transporting his friends, careful about maintenance and safety. And then there was Gary Mathias, 25, who had also served in the military and who managed his schizophrenia so effectively with medication that his family said he'd been completely stable for 2 years. These weren't children. They weren't helpless. In modern terms, most would likely be recognized as being on the autism spectrum, probably what we'd now call Asperger's syndrome, meaning they were socially awkward at times, but absolutely capable of holding jobs, maintaining friendships and living independent lives. Their bond was basketball. They played together for Gateway's team, the Gators, and they were good enough to have qualified for a Special Olympics tournament scheduled for February 25, 1978. This tournament mattered to them. Their families would later emphasize that these men lived for that tournament, that they'd been practicing for months, that missing it was unthinkable. So on February 24th, the night before their big day, they did something perfectly ordinary. They decided to drive from Yuba City up to Chico, about 50 miles north, to watch a college basketball game between UC Davis and Chico State. It was a Friday night. They were excited. UC Davis won, and the men cheered enthusiastically throughout the game. Witnesses remembered them because they were so obviously enjoying themselves. After the game ended around 10:30 at night, they stopped at a convenience store, bought some snacks and drinks, laughed and joked with the clerk, and got back into Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego for the drive home. Everything about their behavior suggested they were planning to go straight home, get some rest, and wake up ready for their tournament. Instead, somewhere on that drive, something happened that would turn a routine Friday night into an enduring nightmare. The route home should have been simple. Highway 70 runs south from Chico, back toward Yuba City, a straight shot they'd driven before, well lit in town, clearly marked, impossible to get seriously lost on even if you took a wrong turn. But the Mercury Montego never made it home. Instead, at some point near the town of Oroville, roughly 23 miles into their journey, the car turned off the main highway and began climbing into the Plumas National Forest. Think about that for a moment. They drove 23 miles in the correct direction, past numerous turnoffs, through a town where Matthias actually had friends, and then suddenly veered onto a mountain road that led away from everything familiar, away from civilization, away from any possible help. The road they turned onto, the Oroville-Quincy Highway, wasn't some slight detour. It climbed thousands of feet in elevation, winding through increasingly remote terrain, through snow that got deeper with every mile. None of the men were dressed for mountain conditions. They had light jackets suitable for a February evening in the valley, not for sub-freezing temperatures at high altitude. They had no camping gear, no survival equipment, no reason anyone could fathom for being up there at all. Madruga's Mercury Montego was eventually found on February 28th, 4 days after the men disappeared, but not by searchers looking on main roads. It was discovered on a remote Forest Service access road, a track so obscure that even locals rarely used it, especially not in winter when it was buried under snow. The car was stuck in a snowbank, but here's where things start to become truly strange. The vehicle was in good condition. It had a quarter tank of gas, enough to idle for 5 to 8 hours, keeping the men warm through even the coldest night. The keys were missing, presumably taken by whoever abandoned it, but the car itself showed no signs of mechanical failure. There was food still in the vehicle. There were maps. The windows weren't broken. Nothing suggested the car had been attacked, or that the men had fled in immediate panic. But there were odd details that investigators couldn't explain. The rear window had a small crack in it. One of the wheels had been spun so hard against a snow berm that it had lifted the entire undercarriage, suggesting someone had desperately tried to rock the car free, pushing the gas pedal to the floor. And most puzzling of all, the car had been carefully backed into position, not driven forward until it got stuck. Someone had deliberately maneuvered it to where it was found, but the men themselves had vanished. Massive search efforts combed the area around the car, using dogs, helicopters, experienced mountain rescue teams who knew that terrain intimately. They found nothing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The families held vigils, offered rewards, and begged the media to keep the story alive. And then in June, 4 months after the disappearance, a motorcyclist riding through a remote section of the Plumas National Forest, nearly 19 miles from where the Montego had been found, noticed something odd about a Forest Service trailer. The door was open. Curious, he went inside, and what he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The body of Ted Via lay on a makeshift bed, wrapped in blankets. Medical examiners would later determine he'd been dead for weeks, possibly months. He'd lost between 70 and 80 pounds. He'd died slowly of starvation and exposure, his body consuming itself trying to stay warm. But here's what made his death go from tragic to utterly inexplicable. The trailer was stocked with supplies. There were sea rations, military surplus food that could have sustained him for months. There was a propane heater with tanks attached, fully functional, that could have kept the entire space warm. There were blankets beyond what he'd used. There was a box of matches. Everything he needed to survive was right there within arm's reach, and yet he'd used almost none of it. The sea rations were mostly unopened, though investigators found evidence he'd eaten small amounts of some. The propane heater had never been lit, though he'd clearly known about it because he'd moved some items near it. Instead, Via had apparently tried to heat the trailer using small chunks of wood in an improvised fire that never generated enough warmth, while a functioning heater sat unused mere feet away. Over the next several days, as investigators searched the area more thoroughly, they found more bodies. Bill Sterling's skeletal remains were located in the woods not far from the trailer, his body scattered by animals. Jack Madruga's remains were found even farther away, in a location that suggested he'd been trying to move in some specific direction, though toward what, no one could say. Jack Hewitt's remains turned up in a different area entirely, far from the others, as if he'd split off from the group and gone his own way. All of them had died of exposure, their bodies telling stories of slow death in freezing temperatures. But Gary Matthias was never found. His shoes turned up in the trailer, suggesting he'd been there at some point, but no trace of his body has ever been discovered, despite extensive searches that continued for years. Some investigators theorized his body might have been dragged off by animals, but others pointed out that even in that scenario, bones should have eventually. So we're left with 4 questions that have defined this mystery for nearly 5 decades. First, why did these men who desperately wanted to be home and rested for their tournament turn onto a remote mountain road that led nowhere they needed to go? Second, why did they abandon a functioning car that could have kept them alive through the night, choosing instead to trek on foot through deep snow in the dark? Third, why did Ted Wire, a man with military training who had weeks or possibly months to figure out how to use basic survival supplies, apparently starve to death while surrounded by food and freeze, while sitting next to a heater he never lit? And fourth, what in the name of everything rational happened to Gary Mathias? Every answer investigators have proposed creates new questions. Every theory that explains one aspect of the case fails to explain another. And at the center of all of it, hovering like a dark cloud over every timeline and every reconstruction, is one man whose testimony forms the backbone of what we think we know, but whose story shifts and changes with every telling. Joseph Shones was 55 years old in February 1978, a resident of Berry Creek, a small community along the Oroville-Quincy Highway. If you'd asked his neighbors about him, you wouldn't have heard many kind words. Most described him as abrasive, quarrelsome, the kind of man who drank too much and started arguments in public. He had a reputation as a bully, someone who threw his weight around and made people uncomfortable. This matters because when the Yuba County Five went missing and Shones came forward, claiming to have been on that mountain road the same night, claiming to have seen the men, local residents were shocked that authorities were taking him seriously. But investigators had no choice. He was the only person who could place the men on that road, the only witness who claimed any knowledge of what had happened. So let's examine his story carefully, because its inconsistencies might be the key to understanding everything. On the afternoon of February 24th, Shones stopped at the Mountain House Lodge, a weathered bar perched on the edge of the Plumas National Forest. Staff remembered him drinking beers around 5 o'clock. What they found odd was that after drinking, he left the bar and drove not toward his home in Berry Creek, but up toward the snow line, heading deeper into the mountains on a pass notorious for trapping vehicles for hours. Why would a man who'd been drinking drive into hazardous mountain terrain as night approached? Shones claimed that while driving up the snowy incline, his Volkswagen Beetle veered off the track into deep snow. As he struggled to push the car free, he said he suffered a heart attack. Weak, gasping, barely conscious, he crawled back into his Beetle, started the engine for warmth and waited, expecting to die on that frozen mountain. Hours passed. Then around midnight, he saw headlights approaching and watched as another car came to a stop about 100 yards behind him. It was a Mercury Montego. What happened next depends entirely on which version of Shones's story you believe, because he's told several, and they don't match. In his earliest retellings to investigators, Shones described seeing 5 shadowy figures climb out of the Montego, pause as if conferring, and then retreat into the forest without a word, disappearing into the darkness. He claimed he called out for help, but they ignored him completely as if he didn't exist. In later accounts, Shones added a crucial new element, a red pickup truck. He claimed that shortly after Montego arrived, a pickup appeared, driven by a man with a woman and a baby inside. Sometimes Shones said he saw the 5 men climb into the truck bed. Other times he said the men simply vanished into the darkness and the truck drove away separately. The truck appears and disappears from his story, depending on who he's talking to and when. He never could keep the details straight about whether the men got in the truck, whether the truck followed them, or whether it was even there at all. Whatever version he was telling, Shones insisted he tried calling out for help repeatedly, but was completely ignored by everyone. By dawn, he claimed his Beetle had run out of fuel and he was on the verge of freezing to death. So he began what he described as a torturous 8-mile walk back down the highway toward Mountain House Lodge. Let's pause here because this part of his story creates immediate problems. Shones claimed he'd suffered a heart attack severe enough to leave him weak and gasping, unable to push his car free, barely conscious. Modern medical understanding tells us that a person who's just had a serious heart attack should not be capable of walking 8 miles through snow in freezing temperatures. The exertion alone would likely trigger another cardiac event or cause complete collapse. But according to Shones, not only did he complete this impossible walk, he did so after spending an entire night in a freezing car with no heat, When he finally arrived at Mountain House Lodge, employees remember him entering the bar, ordering water and aspirin, and sitting down to talk with other patrons. Here's what's truly bizarre about this. He said absolutely nothing about being stranded in the mountains, nothing about his beetle being stuck, nothing about having suffered a heart attack, nothing about seeing 5 strangers abandon their car in the middle of the night. He just sat there, drank water, took aspirin, and made casual conversation. At least one witness later told investigators that Shones kept repeating the phrase, "I should have done this 2 years ago," which struck them as odd but not alarming. For a man who should have been in desperate need of emergency medical attention, his behavior made no sense at all. After a few minutes, a couple at the bar offered Shones a ride home to Berry Creek. During the drive, they later reported, he complained constantly about the driver's abilities, criticizing every turn and stop, behavior that seemed bizarre for someone who'd nearly died and should have been grateful for any help at all. When Shones arrived home, he told his wife Cindy about his ordeal, though we can't verify exactly what he said. What we do know is that instead of immediately rushing him to the hospital for treatment of a potentially fatal heart attack, Cindy focused on recovering his Volkswagen. She enlisted a local man to help, and they drove back up the mountain where they found Shones's beetle, exactly where he'd described it. The battery was dead. The fuel tank was empty. Everything matched his account of being stranded. But they also saw something else. Another vehicle abandoned nearby, a Mercury Montego, doors unlocked, windows intact, sitting silent in the snow. It wasn't until the following day, more than 30 hours after his alleged heart attack, that Shones was finally taken to a hospital. And here we encounter another major problem with verifying his story. The medical records from his hospital stay have vanished. No one can locate them. We have no documentation of what treatment he received, whether doctors confirmed he'd had a heart attack, or what his condition actually was. Cindy Shones later told people that when her husband came home, he was inconsolable, barely able to speak about what had happened without breaking down emotionally. Yet this directly contradicts how bar employees described him just hours earlier, calmly drinking water and chatting as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Which version was true? Was he traumatized or perfectly composed? It depends on who you ask and when you ask them. In the weeks that followed, as the search for the 5 missing men intensified and media coverage exploded, Joseph Shones inserted himself into the narrative. He gave interviews to law enforcement, to newspapers, to television reporters. He spoke with the worried families, offering them his account of that night. But investigators quickly noticed something troubling. His story changed depending on who he was talking to and what day it was. Sometimes he mentioned drinking only 1 or 2 beers at Mountain House before heading up the mountain. Other times he admitted to 6 or more. Sometimes the red pickup truck was central to his narrative, with detailed descriptions of the man, woman, and baby inside. Other times he didn't mention the truck at all, acting as if the 5 men had simply wandered into the forest alone. To police, he hinted darkly that the men may have been abducted, suggesting foul play by unknown parties. To journalists, he suggested more innocently that the men had simply ignored his calls for help, perhaps not hearing him over the wind. To the families, he expressed confusion and sorrow, claiming he wished he could have done more, but had been too weak from his heart attack. The contradictions in Shones' testimony led many people to doubt him entirely. Some investigators theorized he might have been angling for the $10,000 reward the families had offered, for information about the missing men, a substantial sum in 1978 that would be worth much more today. Others wrote him off as lonely and attention-seeking, a man embellishing or outright fabricating stories to inject himself into a major news event. But there's another possibility that's harder to dismiss, one that's darker and more troubling. Joseph Shones had a reputation in Berry Creek for being aggressive, unpredictable, and volatile, especially when drinking. What if he didn't just witness something that night? What if he was involved in whatever caused the men to abandon their car and flee into the wilderness? Think about the only behavior that would cause 5 men to leave a warm vehicle and trek on foot through deep snow in the dark. Fear. Not confusion, not poor decision-making, but genuine terror of staying on that road. If Shones, possibly drunk, possibly with others, had confronted the men in a threatening way, it might explain everything that followed. The vehicle specifications for a 1969 Mercury Montego indicate it could idle for 5 to 8 hours on a quarter tank of fuel, more than enough time to keep 5 men warm until sunrise, when they could have safely walked back down the road to civilization. 2 of the men, Vihar and Matthias, had military training. They understood the principle of shelter, of conserving energy, of waiting for daylight before attempting to navigate unfamiliar terrain. The only scenario in which they would abandon that shelter is if staying with the car felt more dangerous than facing the wilderness. Think about what that means. Something or someone on that road scared them so badly that freezing to death in the mountains seemed like a better option than remaining with their vehicle. This has led many researchers to focus obsessively on the sometimes there, sometimes not element in Shones's story, the red pickup truck. If that truck was real, then there were other people on the mountain that night. But who were they? What role did they play? Why has no one ever come forward to explain what happened? Shones mentioned one detail that's particularly intriguing and particularly suspicious. He claimed that on the morning after the incident, when he walked past the abandoned Mercury Montego on his way down the mountain, he looked inside and saw either baby toys or baby clothes in the back seat. This detail didn't appear in any police report about the vehicle's contents when it was officially discovered 4 days later. Investigators found food, found maps, found personal belongings, but no baby items. Now, the Montego wasn't secured immediately after Shones allegedly saw it. His wife and her helper found it the next day, but it wasn't until the 28th that police actually processed it as evidence. That means there was a window of opportunity for someone to return to the vehicle and remove items they didn't want discovered. Why would someone remove baby items? Perhaps because they didn't want to be connected to that car, to that location, to whatever happened that night. If Shones's story about the red truck and the family inside is true, if the men did climb into the truck bed seeking help from people who seemed harmless, a man, a woman, and a baby, then those people know exactly what happened and have stayed silent for nearly 50 years. But why would they stay silent if they were innocent? If they'd simply offered help and somehow the men ended up dying anyway, what would stop them from coming forward? Let's explore the theories that have emerged over the decades, because each one explains certain facts while failing to account for others. The most commonly cited theory is that the men were chased up the mountain road by someone or someone intending them harm. If they were being pursued, it would explain the route they took. Desperate turns onto increasingly remote roads trying to shake their pursuers. It would explain why they abandoned the car once it got stuck, knowing it would be immediately spotted by anyone following them. It would even explain why they might have chosen to hide in a Forest Service trailer, rather than attempting to hike back to civilization, afraid their pursuers might still be looking for them. But this theory requires answering a crucial question: who was chasing them and why? Early speculation focused on the possibility that the men had gotten into an altercation after the basketball game, perhaps with hostile spectators or people in the parking lot. But this theory has significant problems. If someone was pursuing them immediately after the game, why would the men stop at a convenience store to buy snacks? Surely they would have driven straight home or to a police station or somewhere safe. And why would they drive 23 miles toward home before suddenly turning into the mountains? If they needed help, Oroville, the town they drove through, would have been the obvious place to find it, with police stations, hospitals, and hundreds of potential witnesses. So some researchers have proposed a variation. What if the altercation didn't happen after the game, but in Oroville itself? Gary Matthias had friends in Oroville, so it's plausible the men might have decided to make a quick stop there on their way home, maybe to visit someone, maybe just to use a restroom or grab more snacks. In 1978, Oroville had a reputation for being rough around the edges, with a bar scene that attracted hard-drinking loggers and transient workers. People who didn't take kindly to strangers, especially strangers who seemed different. With their social awkwardness and the subtle markers of developmental differences, the 5 men would unfortunately have been obvious targets for harassment. It's not hard to imagine a scenario where they stopped somewhere in Oroville, were mocked or threatened by locals spoiling for a fight, and fled, with their tormentors pursuing them in vehicles. If this happened, it might explain the open California road map found in the back seat of the Montego. Maybe the men were frantically trying to find alternate routes, looking for any way off the main highway to shake the people following them. When they turned onto the mountain road, perhaps they thought it was a legitimate alternate route that would eventually loop back to familiar territory. By the time they realized how remote and dangerous the road was, they were already trapped. But some researchers believe the targeting wasn't random at all. They focused specifically on Gary Mathias, the only member of the group who was never found. Several Oroville residents have come forward over the years, claiming that Mathias had ongoing conflicts with certain locals, that he'd gotten into at least one physical fight at a party in the months before the disappearance. There are persistent stories about a confrontation between Mathias and a man named Faren Diozier, who happened to be married to Jack Hewitt's sister, making him connected to the group through family ties. Could someone with a personal grudge against Mathias have spotted him that night and decided to settle their score? Could the other 4 men have died simply because they were with him when violence erupted? This theory gained unexpected support in 2017, when someone claiming to be Jack Hewitt's sister-in-law, possibly Diozier's wife, came forward with a startling claim. She stated that on the night of the disappearance, Gary Mathias had been attacked and thrown off a bridge, and witnessing this violence had caused his 4 friends to panic and flee for their lives. If this account is true, it would explain why Mathias was never found. His body potentially swept away by water or hidden in terrain that searchers never adequately checked. It would explain why the other men acted irrationally, why they drove into danger instead of seeking help, because they'd just watched their friend murdered and feared they'd be next. There is indeed a large bridge along the route they would have taken, the Bidwell Bar Bridge at the entrance to the mountain highway. Some researchers claim shell casings were found near the entrance to the mountain pass, though this has never been officially confirmed. If someone had fired shots at the men, they would have been absolutely justified in their panicked flight deeper into the mountains. Others point to rumors that surfaced in the 1990s about a local bully, someone mentioned by Gary's family as having threatened him in the past. According to these rumors, this individual allegedly confessed during a church service to having led a group of disabled men to their deaths, a confession that would seem to solve the entire mystery. But no direct witness to this alleged confession has ever come forward publicly, and no investigation was ever launched based on these rumors. It's possible the story was distorted through retellings, or that someone misunderstood a vague statement made in an emotional church context, or that the whole thing was fabricated. Still, it feeds into a larger pattern that many researchers have identified. The sense that someone in the community knows more than they're saying, that someone is carrying the weight of terrible knowledge and has chosen silence over disclosure. And there's another frequently overlooked aspect of this case that might explain why someone would target these men specifically. Gateway Projects, the non-profit organization that supported all 5 men, had been the focus of sustained harassment for years before the disappearance. Between 1975 and 1976, someone waged what can only be described as a terror campaign against the organization, setting fires at Gateway facilities and even burning several vehicles belonging to the program. The attacks culminated in horror on April 6, 1975, when Donald Garrett, Gateway's director, answered a knock at his apartment door late at night and was immediately doused with flammable liquid and set on fire. He died almost instantly, suffering unimaginable agony. The killer was never identified despite intensive investigation. Rumors circulated about jealous lovers, workplace feuds, personal grudges, but no one was ever charged. Some researchers have theorized that one or more members of the Yuba County Five might have known something about the arsonist's identity. Perhaps had seen something suspicious or overheard conversations that could have pointed investigators in the right direction. If the killer knew or suspected that these men could identify him, their disappearance might have been an attempt to permanently silence potential witnesses before they could come forward. It's a chilling theory, and there's some circumstantial support for it. Apparently, some researchers claim they've identified a possible suspect for the Gateway arsons and the murder of Donald Garrett, but no name has been publicly disclosed, leaving us with questions and no answers, the recurring theme of this entire case. And then there's the theory that most people dismiss immediately, but that becomes harder to ignore the deeper you dig into the details. What if something genuinely paranormal happened that night? What if these men encountered something so far outside normal human experience that it drove them into irrational terror? There's a police report that rarely gets mentioned. A witness statement from a woman named Janet Kathleen Enzera, who told investigators that Gary Mathias had confided in her repeatedly about a recurring nightmare he'd been having. In his dream, he saw himself and several others vanishing, being taken away alongside strange lights and beings from somewhere beyond Earth. At the time, investigators dismissed this as irrelevant, just the confused ramblings of a man with documented mental illness. But when you place it alongside what actually happened, when you consider that Mathias did indeed vanish without leaving any trace, the statement becomes unsettling in ways that are hard to articulate. Throughout history, there have been numerous documented cases of vehicles pursued by unidentified flying objects, drivers reporting being followed for miles by lights in the sky that seem to exhibit intelligent control, sometimes experiencing engine trouble or electronic interference, always describing overwhelming feelings of dread and wrongness. The Oroville-Quincy Highway, which the men traveled that night, would have been almost completely deserted after midnight. Outside of town limits, there were no streetlights, no traffic, no houses for long stretches, just absolute blackness pressing in from both sides of the road. In such isolated conditions, an encounter with something unusual would have been terrifying beyond description. If some kind of aerial phenomenon or object had descended on or near the Mercury Montego, tracking it, hovering over it, the men's panic would be completely understandable. Suddenly leaving the main highway and turning onto a remote forest road might have been a desperate attempt to escape whatever was following them, perhaps thinking that heavy tree cover would provide protection. If Gary Mathias had been taken or disappeared in full view of his four friends, the psychological trauma could explain every apparently irrational decision that followed: why they fled into the wilderness, why Ted Vire seemed unable to function normally even when surrounded by survival supplies, why everything about their behavior suggested people in a state of profound shock. Of course, this is speculation at its most extreme, the kind of theory that most serious investigators reject immediately. The far more plausible explanation, the one that Occam's razor would suggest, is that something very human happened on that mountain road, whether foul play, tragic miscommunication, or a cascade of poor decisions that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Which brings us back inevitably to Joseph Shones, the man whose testimony forms the foundation of every timeline, but whose story is so riddled with contradictions that it might be worse than useless. The most generous interpretation of Shones's behavior is that he's simply an unreliable witness, someone whose memory was compromised by stress, alcohol, and possibly actual medical trauma, making him incapable of providing accurate testimony, even if he wanted to. But there are too many specific inconsistencies for that explanation to fully satisfy. Why does the red truck appear and disappear from his accounts? Why claim to see baby items in Montego that don't appear in police reports? Why wait so long to mention details that should have been immediately obvious if they actually happened? The less generous interpretation is that Shones fabricated the entire story to claim the reward money that the families had offered, that he knew he'd been on the mountain that night and needed a cover story to explain his presence once the missing car was discovered near his stuck Beetle. Maybe the heart attack never happened. Maybe he was just drunk and got his car stuck and knew that bar employees could place him on that road, so he invented an elaborate lie. But there's a third interpretation, one that's darker and fits more of the facts than any other theory. What if Joseph Shones wasn't just a witness? What if he was a participant in whatever happened that night? Consider how isolated that Forest Service road was in 1978. Today it's paved, marked, and relatively traveled during daylight hours. But in 1978, it was little more than a rough track, remote beyond imagining, used by almost no one during winter months. So what are the odds that Joseph Shones, a man with a reputation for drunken aggression and bullying, just happened to be on that specific road on that specific night when one of the most baffling mysteries in American history unfolded? Coincidences happen, but this strains credibility. Thieves and predators have long used staged breakdowns as a tactic to victimize unsuspecting travelers. Someone appears to need help, stranded by the roadside, desperate for assistance. When good Samaritans stop to help, they're robbed, assaulted, or worse. What if Shones had agreed to participate in exactly this kind of scheme? What if the people in the red truck, assuming they existed, flagged down the Mercury Montego somewhere near Oroville, claiming their friend or family member was stuck up on the mountain and desperately needed help pushing a car free. The presence of a woman and baby in the truck would have been powerfully disarming, signaling safety and innocence, making the 5 men feel like heroes coming to rescue a stranded family. When they arrived at Shones's Volkswagen Beetle, the scenario would have seemed exactly as described. A car genuinely stuck in snow, a man who appeared to need assistance. But what if it was a trap? Maybe Shones, possibly the people from the truck, possibly all of them together, pulled weapons once the 5 men were in an isolated location with no escape route. Maybe they intended simple robbery, threatening the men to hand over wallets and valuables. But what if something went wrong? What if Gary Mathias, who had military training and a history of standing up to bullies, fought back or tried to resist? What if violence erupted? Mathias was killed and the other 4 men fled in terror into the darkness. Suddenly everyone involved would have been in serious trouble. If the 4 witnesses returned and reported what happened, Shones and anyone with him would face murder charges. So perhaps they waited, keeping watch on the road to make sure the men didn't come back. When morning arrived and the men hadn't reappeared, perhaps the criminals took the keys from the Mercury, split whatever money they'd stolen and left, convinced that the wilderness and exposure would eliminate the witnesses more efficiently than they ever could. This theory explains why the men would abandon a perfectly functional car. They were fleeing immediate danger and couldn't risk staying near the road where their attackers were waiting. It explains why they might have chosen to hide rather than hike out, fearing their pursuers might still be hunting for them. It explains Shones's presence on the mountain, not coincidence but premeditation. It explains the red truck's appearance and disappearance from his story. He was having trouble keeping track of which lies he'd told to whom. It explains why medical records vanished. There was no heart attack to document. And it explains why no one from the mysterious truck has ever come forward, because they're complicit in what happened, and self-preservation demands silence. Unfortunately, Joseph Shones died years ago, taking whatever truth he possessed to his grave. We'll never know if he was an innocent witness traumatized by what he saw, a fantasist seeking attention and reward money, or an active participant in events that led to 4 deaths and 1 permanent disappearance. What we're left with are fragments, pieces of a puzzle that don't quite fit together no matter how we arrange them. Ted Wire somehow survived for weeks or possibly months in that Forest Service trailer, long enough to lose nearly 80 pounds, long enough to go through the food supplies bite by small bite, but apparently never able or willing to properly utilize the heater that could have saved his life. Was he injured? Was he in shock so profound that he couldn't think clearly? Was he afraid to make smoke or noise that might draw attention from whoever he feared was still hunting for them? We don't know. Bill Sterling, Jack Madruga, and Jack Hewitt died of exposure in the woods around the trailer, their remains scattered by animals and weather, leaving no clues about what they were doing or where they thought they were going when they died. And Gary Mathias simply vanished, leaving only his shoes behind, as if he walked out of the trailer in socks and disappeared into the forest or into something else entirely. Nearly 50 years have passed since that February night. The families of these 5 men have aged. Some have passed away themselves, all carrying the burden of questions that may never be answered. Recent research has brought renewed attention to the case, particularly the work of investigators who've uncovered previously overlooked details, who've challenged the lazy assumptions about these men's capabilities, who've taken seriously the possibility that Joseph Shones was hiding something crucial. For the families of Ted Wire, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Gary Mathias, this renewed interest offers a fragile measure of hope that someday, somehow, the truth of what happened on that frozen mountain road might finally emerge into light. Maybe someone who knows something will finally come forward, freed by time or conscience, or the death of someone they were protecting. Maybe some piece of physical evidence will be discovered, something overlooked in the original searches. Maybe advances in forensic technology will reveal something new from old evidence. Or maybe the mystery will endure forever. Another unsolved tragedy in a world full of them. What we can say with certainty is this: 5 friends went to watch a basketball game on a February evening in 1978. They should have driven home, slept in their own beds, woken up excited for their tournament. Instead, they ended up 70 miles off course on a road they had no business traveling, where they abandoned a perfectly functional vehicle and trekked through deep snow into wilderness that would kill 4 of them and consume the 5th without leaving a trace. Something happened on that drive home, something that has not been adequately explained by any theory yet proposed. Whether it was human evil, tragic confusion, or something stranger than either, we may never know. But the question remains, hanging in the cold mountain air like breath on a winter night, waiting for an answer that might never come. What happened to the Yuba County Five? And more disturbingly, who knows the answer and has chosen for nearly 50 years to stay silent? Until those questions are resolved, their story endures. A reminder of how quickly ordinary life can turn into a nightmare, of how fragile the boundary is between safety and catastrophe, of 5 friends who set out together on a February night and never came home. May they rest in peace, their memories honored, their story told, their deaths not forgotten until justice, however long delayed, finally arrives.